That, of course, is the Bangles, and the lead vocal there by Susanna Hoffs, our guest today. The minute we started this podcast, I actually said we got to get Susanna on the show because she is what I call a classic record nerd. Every move of the career of the Bangles and her career as a solo artist has been informed by her record collection, and it's very evident in our conversation. Of course, you might know her also from the Under the Covers cover compilations she's done with Matthew Sweet, sometimes referred to as Sid and Susie, their nicknames. And I'm going to just roll it because it was such a fun thing to do. And of course, during this lockdown time, I would have loved to have talked to her in person, but it's the safest thing that I called her in Los Angeles. And as it turns out, you'll see, me being up near Berkeley is a perfect way to open the interview. So here it is, Susanna Hoffs on the Record Store Day podcast. You're in LA, I'm in Berkeley. I think you studied here, didn't you?
Did. I am a graduate of UC Berkeley, indeed. And Berkeley was actually quite foundational to my music journey, my journey in music.
Oh, explain that. I know you grew up in Los Angeles, and I guess you went to Pacific Palisades High School or Palisades High School?
Yeah, Pally High, as we called it. A book was Class of 65, this famous book about Pally High. But anyway, yeah, I don't want to digress, but
no,
yeah,
but cool.
I did that school. And yeah, and I went and I studied and graduated from University of California at Berkeley and in the late 70s, and it was a very interesting time to be there because though I started in the theater dance department and was part of the dance company, I ended up graduating as an art major, but that is where David Roback and I started our first band, and the band was it was a very heady time being art students at Berkeley in the late 70s, right as the sort of tectonic shift between rock and roll being associated with stadiums and The Who and Zeppelin and rock gods to this kind of grungy San Francisco club scene, but also new wave and sort of the intersection of all that. And because I was living in the Bay Area on the East Bay, I had the great, fortune to make the trek into San Francisco to Winterland Ballroom and see both Patti Smith and what turned out to be the final Sex Pistols show. And, but like Elvis Costello was starting out and coming through town, and all kinds of bands were playing the Mabuhay Gardens, the Fab Mab in city, and so I got to the city a lot, San Francisco, and also there was stuff happening in Berkeley. There was a lot of. I remember I saw. Now I'm forgetting the name of the band for a split second. It'll come to me later, but I saw lots of great punk and new wave performances in the Bay Area at that time. And it was sort of the beginning of my journey. Well, I would say I always describe that it was where the sort of intersection of theater and music and dance and writing and even the visual part of what I considered to be all one big thing kind of coalesced in Berkeley. And I think the idea of the band as an art project was sort of how I approached it. And that's why it was so amazing that David and I had this birth of our own first, kind of group there, which never really made an album, but we ended up influencing each other's bands as we went on. And the Rainy Day record was kind of the recording that most, expressed what our early moments in Berkeley collaborating sounded like.
Yeah, that's now a legendary sort of associated with the Paisley Underground to some degree, because of when you did form, as we were just about to say, the Bangs came out of you when you got back to LA, I guess, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it started with David in Berkeley, and then I graduated, came back to LA, and that was all I wanted to do. At one point there was thought that David and I would continue doing what we originally called ourselves the Psychiatrists, and then we became the Unconscious. But then it just was one of those things where at a certain point in 1980, I just was driven to start again and think about a new band. And that's when I was really hitting the clubs in LA, going to the whiskey, and kind of sowing the seeds of what that would become. And fortuitously, I advertised myself in the LA Recycler. But I always like to say, like, anything was recycled, like band members, like couches,
right,
cars. It's where I got all my first instruments and amps, and also stumbled upon the Peterson sisters in a kind of strange way, because I actually was advertising myself in the Recycler, seeking musicians like-minded, and I was also calling ads of other people's ads, and it turned out that I rang through and Vicki answered the phone. The ad had actually been placed by their roommate, Vicki and Debbie's roommate, but it led me to Vicki and Debbie. So that Recycler, which is the Craigslist of its time, pre-internet, was how it all happened, and it happened very fast. As soon as I met the Petersons, as soon as we met up in the garage that I was actually living in on my parents' the actual converted garage of my parents' house, my childhood home. That's where we played together the first time, and that's where we decided that very night to be a band.
And so it's interesting. There's a couple of threads I want to go down. One is that I guess I read, was it Tracy Thorn's book, and she talked about starting a girl group when she first started with the Marine Girls, and she said part of what she was interested in was it was easier, she felt, than trying to explain yourself to dudes. Yeah, so if you find like-minded women, and in your case, the Peterson sisters, you guys all sound like the biggest record nerds, and I imagine that kind of drew you to each other, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the musical glue was finding Vicki and Debbie to be, first of all, incredibly obsessed with the Beatles, and that the Beatles were sort of the start of their musical infatuation, as it was for me. Vicki and Debbie's parents actually woke them up as little kids to watch the Beatles on Ed Sullivan. My mom had a connection. One of her best friends worked at Capitol Records, so we got all 3 Beatles records. She would always bring home a copy for us. So all of my original Beatle albums were like probably early pressings of all those Beatles records. So as a little tiny kid, I was singing along to those records and listening over and over and over again to them, as with my brothers. I'm the middle of 3 kids with an older and a younger brother. So when I met Vicki and Debbie, it was like almost like our own little Beatles convention in my garage. So that was kind of like the beginning of it, but it went beyond the Beatles. I mean, we had deep knowledge of so many groups, more obscure groups from the 60s, because during my Berkeley years, there was just some great record stores in Berkeley, and with David, we became this sort of avid record collectors. So we kind of went, because it was pre-internet. You couldn't just like put in a search bar and say like the Trogs and figure out that's that song. I kind of remember from being in the back seat of the station wagon in my mom's car going to school. That's that song that was on KHJ. So we scoured the record stores in Berkeley, and we kind of rediscovered the soundtrack of our own childhoods, in the 70s, going back to and gathering up all these great vintage, 60s records from those record stores. And so, the combination of being like really smitten with the kind of art bands like the Talking Heads and also, Patti Smith and then having access to these great record stores and kind of almost archaeological dig into our own deep connection to the songs that we grew up with, but we didn't really know those groups. I mean, we knew the Beatles, obviously, we knew the Stones, but we didn't know the Trogs. We didn't know that it was this group and that group that recorded all these amazing singles that we, listened to on the way to back,
Is that where you got kind of deeper into things like Emmett Rhodes?
Oh, yeah. Well, Emmett Rhodes, yeah, exactly. And that was a big, Emmett Rhodes was, and the merry-go-round were a big thing for the Bangles, because in Vicki and Debbie, I found we were almost like these kind of Nancy Drews of going and, like I said, going and rediscovering and investigating the mysterious music that we loved as kids. But now, we've cut to, and now it's, 1980, and we're wanting to go back and pull from that, all that gold that we actually hunted down Emmett Rhodes and found him in the South Bay area and just sought him out. And he wasn't doing, the kind of music he had done in the 60s when we found him, and we wanted him to produce our first single. He kind of basically essentially wasn't into it. Yeah. It was all good. It was like we hunted him down. And, and then later I had a chance to sing on a newer record of Emmett's. But, yeah, I mean, we ended up covering the song Live, I think, on the first Bangles record. It was the fact that I met through an ad in the paper, Vicki and Debbie, who were approximately, we're all the same age, and yet we had this crazy obsession with 60s music. And we wanted to drag the 60s into the 80s.
Yeah, and that's kind of mission accomplished. I mean, that's what, like earlier I alluded to the Paisley Underground. I mean, that's the only, so scenes are written by journalists usually, but in this case, there's a lot in common between you and the Rain Parade and Dream Syndicate, and yet they're all different, completely different. But that tour you did, the reunion tour a few years ago, really got across that there is such a thing as I don't know if it's uniformity, but it's like a like-mindedness in the approach.
Yes, absolutely. I think there's something about us kind of coming into adulthood, but realizing the power and the impact of being music lovers at a very, very early age, and wanting to take some of the things we loved about that music with us as we created our own music. And it became, a big part of the Bangles sound, the jangly guitars. And I always had a thing for 12-string guitars because I love the Byrds so much.
Oh, yeah.
The jingle jangle just had kind of almost a hypnotic effect on me. And I felt like it almost had like an antidepressant quality to it. There was something so, I was always very moved by the sound of a 12-string guitar, whether it was the Beatles using them or the Byrds. And so, first it was David and I who sought out or found that great 12-string Guild Starfire that I still have from the recycler again.
Oh, wow.
And I still have that guitar, and I still have my original amp. And yes, it was like sort of trying to get under the hood of what those bands were doing. Because, when you're a kid, you just listen and you love, but you don't really know why you love it. You just experience it. You experience music, and then if you start a band, you're like, how'd they do it? How did they achieve that? Why do the hairs on my arm go up when I hear that sound? Why do harmonies move me so much? I mean, that harmonies was a very big part of the Bangles. Like the way that we approached everything. And it was interesting because Vicki and Debbie knew all the harmony parts on the Beatles records, and I always knew the main melody parts, but they had really studied those harmonies. So when they would sing along in the car, they were just expert at falling into harmony. So that was like a really great thing that to do and turn that into 3-part harmony.
She knew what she was.
and they're sisters, so I always believe that there's such a thing as those intuitive, things that happen with sisters, so.
Absolutely, the family blend too, which is like the secret sauce.
Yeah.
Voices are different, yet there's that genetic thing.
Yeah.
Happening, and it's just very special. And so, yeah, that was a huge thing.
It's like it's all very analog. Like, so like you were saying, like the recycler pre-Craigslist, there'd be like a paper, an actual paper, and you had to go physically to crates in record stores to find these things, and then you're physically getting the sound of a Rickenbacker by actually getting one.
Right. and I was remembering, because I know that you talk a lot about record stores, or
yes,
your podcast has to do with that, but I was remembering that my first flyers when I came back from college, before I'd even met Vicki, the only person who answered my flyer was Maria McKee from Lone Justice.
Wow.
So obviously way pre-Lone Justice, but I used to go and put them in the Licorice Pizza and the Music Odyssey. The Warehouse was the first record store I remember going to, I think in Westwood, when I first started buying albums. But I would leave them in record stores, and I left them at the Whiskey A Go-Go. I think the Go-Go's were actually playing, and it was a kind of a sad story because I kept putting my flyers out, and someone kept sticking them in the trash of the ladies' room. I put them in the ladies' room because I was wanting to collaborate with other women, because it was just after having been in a band with David, oops, sorry about that little beep, girl. Silence that phone. You had alluded to this earlier. I was really intrigued with the idea of collaborating with women and kind of mining that sort of the voice that might, not only the sonic texture of that, but like what would drive like the writing in a way, and the perspective. And as things kept going for the Bangles, and we got signed, we're touring, our songs somehow made it onto the radio. It started to be a thing like, why isn't everyone doing this? This is the most empowering thing in the world.
Right.
To be in a band with your fellow women, with other women. And it was just so fun. It was like, I couldn't even, I don't know, it was just the most marvelous thing to be in a band with other girls,
I had Jane Weedland on the show, and she was talking a little bit about the same kind of thing, and it's I think for a guy like me too, like we, guys, like that whole privilege thing, we never even considered the extra trouble that women had to go through to get to that situation. And then, and of course, years later, I mean, some of us are hearing it and getting it, but we just knew the music was good, though. Just so you know, even if the media tried to oversell the cheesecake angle on both you and the Go-Go's, there was always a sense. There's always a sense that it really was a great, like the Bangles really made great records.
But it was fun too. There was a feeling, and it always struck me that there weren't. I was always struck that there weren't more all-female bands, But that said, it was very fun and empowering to get, to plug in an electric guitar and just be up there, and the songs driven with the voice and the what we were trying to communicate through the songs, and it was really an interesting experience.
Yeah, you mentioned the harmonies. The harmonies also created an element of, it's like you were like a folk rock band on one level, like they're just like the same sort of triads that you might get from an acoustic folk group, and at the same time there was this solid post 60s 80s rock guitar sound and big drums and all the things that you'd want in a rock and roll band. And but like it became a calling card, I think, is that you had these 3-part harmonies, at least 3 that I could hear.
Oh, definitely. I mean, and again, those influences, like my mom had a lot of Kingston Trio records too.
Oh, right.
Because my uncle taught me to play guitar, and he was very much a folk guy. So yeah, I mean, yeah, we kind of mashed up a lot of a lot of different influences, from psychedelic and kind of like the Trogs all the way to the Mamas and Papas, and the jingle jangle of the Byrds and the Beatles were obviously huge. But just, I grew up, I mean, I kind of taught myself, I'm self-taught. I don't read music, which is terrible that I don't. But I grew up with the folk tradition of my uncle taught me how to play guitar when I was really young, and just asking friends, what's the chord to that hat? Show me how to play Blackbird. And we all taught each other Blackbird, or the beginning of Roundabout, like the little harmonics thing. Like everybody knew a few little things, but we would teach each other in the folk tradition. But but I taught myself to sing by just driving my family crazy and listening to the same record albums over and over again and singing along, Joni Mitchell and Bonnie Raitt and the Beatles and whatever I could get my hands on. But I would just mimic them as best I could, and just try to learn every bit of phrasing, every bit of tonal change, and that's how I did it. I just did it by imitation. And I do think that the Bangles did a lot of covering of songs, and I keep meaning to bring up my stuff with Matthew Sweet.
Well, that's what I was going to get to in terms of record collecting. It's like your singles box is like all those under the covers records, right?
Yeah. And it's like we were kids in a candy store. We were just wanting to enjoy the music that we grew up loving and that we mutually loved. And it was just pure bliss.
Tell me that you've got everything you want, and your bird can sing, but you don't get me. You don't get me. You say you've seen 7 wonders, and your bird is green, but you can't see me. You can't see me.
And of course, putting our own spin on it, but really just the pleasure of it, the pleasure of singing and learning these songs that we love, and, you know, in some cases getting under the hood and how did they do that? You know, why is some of it is just a mystery, better left a mystery, but when you start to play your favorite songs, I mean, it just was pure play and pure bliss. And I think with the Bangles too, you know, some of our songs, we did cover songs. Hazy Shade of Winter was a song that I heard on the radio when I was working a day job where I had to sit alone in a little ceramics factory, and all I had was the radio, and I would listen to KRS 101, and this was in the 80s, so they were playing 60s. And though I thought I knew Simon and Garfunkel really well, I had never heard their folk rock masterpiece of Hazy Shade of Winter. So I was like, this is a perfect song for the Bangles. And then, you know, we ended up recording it, and it was on Less Than Zero, and it became a hit song on the radio for us, very unexpectedly. But we, in the early Bangles shows, we always covered. We covered Pushing Too Hard. We learned in a way by covering songs. And I thought that it's been some kind of a theme in my musical journey to have covered songs. Even with David Roback, when we were first kind of dreaming up what The Unconscious, which was the name of our band, would be, I know somewhere on a cassette I have a recording of us singing Little Honda, the Beach Boys album, but like the Mazzy Star version of that. Me singing and like super reverbed out guitars and that song. You know, like we would test things out by covering songs that we love.
That goes back to the thing you said about going under the hood, right? About deconstructing, I think is the phrase for it. You're deconstructing all these hits, and I mean, even the Beatles did that. I mean, I read George Harrison said that each of the guys they'd learn a song so they could learn a new chord, and then they go, okay, we have to write a song using this minor seventh now because it's so, you know, that
so
major
cool.
to minor shift that John Lennon liked to do. I mean, and Paul liked it too. They got that from another, like probably a show tune. And then they were like, oh, let's put that in a song. And I think it's a tradition. And certainly the smart people, as you know, was it geniuses? Was it? No, is it smart people write original songs, geniuses steal? And it's
Ah,
just it's the idea being that, of course, when you do fashion it as your own, it's never going to be a complete lift, or it shouldn't be. But
right.
that's how you learn how to write songs, and the things you did with Matthew, you surprised me actually. I didn't realize, you never think. I never think other artists are as like listening to things like Yes, who don't sound like Yes,
Right.
and you covered I've Seen All Good People.
Oh my God, that's one of my favorite ones.
And you got Steve Howe to play on it. What you've told me this personally before for another thing, but can you tell the story of how Steve Howe ended up on that?
Well, yes, Matthew and I had the best time coming up with songs. And I remember when we were doing the 70s, the day that I got the call, he's like, "We haven't tapped into prog rock." And I'm like, "Oh my God." And I realized because my brother, John, who's a year older than me, got really into Yes when those records were coming out. And I did too, because it's just gorgeous music. It's very sophisticated and very beautiful. And, so that I've Seen All Good People was just one of my absolute favorite Yes songs. And so I don't remember how, you know what? We just contacted Steve Howe. I don't know. Matthew somehow got his email. He was completely into the idea. We sent him the tracks somehow over the interwebs back in that album came out in 2000 and something.
Oh, I should have had it in front of me for this, but I didn't.
Okay. I think it was 2009 maybe.
Yeah.
Something like that. Anyway, look it up. I don't want to have it wrong. At any rate, we were able to use the internet to help us, because he actually used basically the same guitar. It may not have been the same one, but it was the exact same type of guitar that he played on the original recording. We sent him something. He laid down his track, sent it back, and it was just unreal to have Steve Howe play on that. And I remember driving to Matthew's house, singing over and over and over along with the record. I've Seen All Good People, Your Move. It was just so delicious to study the brilliant John Anderson's vocal performance on that song. I would drive to Matthew's studio and I would sing along in the car over and over and over again. And wow, what a magnificent voice. What a beautiful performance he did on that song. So that was just yummy for me to have that assignment to study that.
I've seen all good people turn their heads each day, so satisfied I'm on my way. I've seen all good people turn their heads each day, so satisfied I'm on my way. Take a straight and stronger course to the corner of your life. Make the white queen run so fast, she hasn't got time to make you a wife. 'Cause it's time in time with your time, and its news is captured.
The most challenging thing about doing the Under the Covers record was how much I loved and revered the songs that we chose to do, cover. And that was just the thing of wanting to do them justice, even when we did them our own way, or kind of moved away from doing, perfect matching. We were never at the outset wanted to kind of copy the records, but I would sing over and over again to the tracks to just sort of study the roadmap of what the original singer had done. And it was just bliss singing along to John Anderson, whose voice is so gorgeous.
You also changed, I think, didn't you, was it Go All the Way? Did you guys cover that? Yeah, the Raspberries, right? And that song gets like 3 times sexier when a woman's singing it.
Well, that was the thing, too. It was like so cool we would make a list, and we wouldn't be like, well, I'm doing that one. It would just be the list, right? We would just be, as I said, kids in a candy store. Oh, God, let's do this one. Oh, let's do that one. And we'd be very excited. And then sometimes Matthew would say, I would assume Matthew was going to do a song, and he'd be like, no, you're going to do it. Like Bell Bottom Blues. I'm like, wait, I thought you were going to do it. He goes, no, you have to do it. I want you to do it. And so I would never say no, but it was so fun because Matthew would always joke and say, I want you to sing all of them. And I'd say, I want you to sing all of them. But somehow we managed to divvy them up. But I was so excited to take on that Raspberry song and tell it from a female point of view because I thought that's going to be very cool.
I never knew how complete love could be till she kissed me and said, baby, please, baby,
go all the way. It feels so right being with you here tonight. Please go all the way. Just hold me close. Don't ever let me go.
I think I may have told you this before, but it was the same kind of almost psychological thing that happens with like in your room. There's something so primal about that idea of the classical idea of a woman being in the guy rock song is like the woman's conquered, but then the idea that the woman has the appetite is like it's such a liberating thing, like.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree with you. I think that was there was it. Yes, it was like the woman owning the situation, owning her sexuality, and it was very cool to take that on and give it a new spin. And that was one of the fun things about doing Under the Covers, actually, that to just play around with perspective changing a little bit in places.
They really were love letters to records. I mean, more than just songs. I really got a sense of you guys with your albums and singles out on someone's room, just sort of like hey, have you heard this one? Like, how about this one? Just spinning them all night, and it's just that's the love of records.
Yeah, I mean, you reminded me that Maggie May was another one where he said, "You're singing it too." And I can't remember if with Go All the Way, I was like, I have to sing this one. But that was another one where it felt really fun to, put the girl voice in the driver's seat, on the song. And anyway, yeah.
And of course, for me, it was very cool that you did, like, as my listeners probably already know, I've mentioned it before, that I wrote a book about Todd Rundgren years ago, and you did like 2 different Todd Rundgren songs in the entire series, at least that I know of, maybe 3. I can't remember.
Oh, we did several, and we did several Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Every once in a while, we'd say to ourselves, well, we just have to do 2 Todd songs and 2 Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers songs, like that. Yes.
Amazing.
We did 2. I mean, Todd is a big part of my being in a band, pre-David Roback, actually. That was the summer between high school and college. I listened to Something Anything. It was the soundtrack of that sort of journey into, I don't know if you're an adult when you're in college, but it felt like this big transitional moment in my life. And that album, it's that thing when you listen to a record hundreds of times where you kind of can't separate it from just that part of your life. It's so embedded in every memory that you have. It's amazing how powerful music is, isn't it?
Oh no, it is. And I think there's something physicalized about the record process too. In the old days, anyway. Maybe I sound like an old guy here, but the idea that you would have to put the needle on the groove, and then when it gets to the end of side 1, you have to get up and flip it over, and also gatefold sleeves on double albums. Like where you had the album.
Well, we wanted a double album on our Under the Covers volume through the 70s, but we didn't end up getting there with that. We have a whole second album of 70s please, waiting to be put out and just mixed, or actually rough mixed. We have a whole, I'm dying to do that. I just really, it's just a matter of Matthew and I getting together and making that happen.
Yeah, and I guess for the time being, nobody's getting together.
Oh no.
But and on that note, one of the things we're talking about a lot lately on this podcast is it's so important that we support record stores by like going to the curbside or ordering off their online things.
I mean, I love record stores and I love records. It's really, at this point, I'm not collecting very many because one of my kids collects records, so that kind of takes care of that for me. But there's nothing like listening to vinyl. There just isn't anything like it. It's much warmer and more beautiful. With all of its little cracks and sizzles, there's just nothing like it.
So what's next for you? Like, I haven't talked to you in a long time about what you've been up to. I saw, obviously before the lockdown of everything, you'd play once in a while at Largo or something. But what have you got planned? Anything for the future?
Well, I've been working for a long time on a book project, and I have an almost finished album that should be coming out. I have a few more vocals to put down, but now, I'm put the pause button on.
Sure.
On that. So I'm just kind of, I sort of stopped doing my residency at Largo for a while so that I could kind of make some content at home and focus entirely on that, recordings and this writing project I've been doing. But I love to sing, play, and perform, but I just want to get these two projects to completion before I start to do that. And now we're kind of this
holding
horrible
pattern.
limbo. Yeah.
So thanks a lot, Sue, for phoning in from Los Angeles, and hopefully, as they say in World War II, we'll meet again after all this is over.
Yes. Thanks so much for having me on your podcast, Paul. More soon, my friend.
Bye.
Bye, Paul. Bye.
I want to show you the picture